And yet we are all busy writing books about citizenship and about the concept. And I think one of the things that's so interesting about boxing is it's a space in which people talk about belonging, not becoming. They talk about what we would categorise as fixity, as certainty, as an embodied belonging. And when the academy is mainly concerned with hybridity, fragmentation and fluidity, the people that we're actually studying are much more likely to seek to stabilise, to provide an identification that gives them some sense of belonging rather than of change. In looking at identities, I've looked at it through links between the personal and the social, the psychic and the social, which involve an accommodation of those, the routine practices of a sport, the embodied practices, and the routine embodied masculinities that are implicated in this sport, as well as through the legends, the myths, the stories that are told. And rather than seeing celebrity and myth and heroism as separate and distinct from routine practice, I see them as imbricated in ways which it's impossible to disengage. I've done it through looking at the personal and the public stories, and also at the embodied practices. And in relation to looking at how one might use the concept of identity, I see a lot of advantage in holding on to the notion of identity even, because it still has a politics of location that I would want to retain. It's not possible to superimpose deconstructive categories onto people who do perceive their sense of being in relation to identity. And so I think it provides a means of negotiating with the people we're actually studying. I've chosen masculinities in this, so you might say, oh, well, it's you'd expect some kind of level of belonging in looking at masculinity in boxing, but it's not only the bodies that are categorised as male that box, it's the bodies that are categorised as female that box as well. But it's the ways in which masculinities are constructed through both routine practices and through the myths, the aspirations that produce the meanings about the sport, which make it very difficult for women to do masculinity. And not that they can't, but that's what they have to do in order to participate. So that's one of the ways in which I think identity provides one means of it's still useful in theorising these understandings. The other issue, I think, in terms of the politics of location that identity carries, is that it does mean that whereas if one looks only at the fluidity and the contingency of identifications, there is a danger of drowning in this sea of contingency and of uncertainty, and it does provide a focus for one's understanding. The kind of way of looking at identification, and particularly at masculinity, as I say, has brought together both social, personal, psychic components. And I think that you can't look at something which, as troubling as boxing, which is, I think, a good example of what Staley, Brass and White call the attraction of repulsion, without also looking at its imaginary and also looking at the unconscious elements that go with the collusions of masculinity that it manifests. And it isn't only about the embodied practitioners of this sport, it's also about the networks, the complicit masculinities that engage with it. In conclusion, I would say that what I've found in this particular area of work in the boxing book is that it's possible not only to have multiple identities, but to accommodate very contradictory and diverse identifications within the same understanding of a person. I wouldn't go quite as far as Gilroy in his use of conviviality, but I think there is a settlement, some kind of way of negotiating what would seem to be an unpopular version of identity. You know, the 21st century, the kind of masculinities that are enacted in boxing might seem to be old-fashioned, traditional, out of date, but they are nevertheless negotiated and accommodated within the set of stories, practices that are told about the sport.
Thanks, Kath. I'm just going to move that back a bit. I'm Helen Lucey, and I'm based in psychology here at the OU, and I'm one of the co-authors of Sibling Identity and Relationships, along with Ros Edwards from South Bank and two other OU people, Lucy Hadfield, who's here, and Melanie Moutner. In answer, just trying to... Was that going all echoey? Go away. Thinking about the question, why do identity scholars keep talking about identities? I think that one of the reasons that psychosocial identity scholars keep talking about identities is because there's no getting away from the very human struggle between the desire to be utterly unique and completely autonomous and free, and the fear of being unique, being alone, perhaps misunderstood and unrecognised because actually no one's like you. And that's why siblings offer such an important opportunity to think about identity and identities, precisely because one of the very distinctive features of siblings and sibling relationships is their seriality. Juliet Mitchell talks about this as the ability to be one among a series of more than one, while at the same time being aware of uniqueness. So that kind of position of being both unique and part of a serial requires a shift in gaze away, really, from the ascendancy of the idea of individualised, autonomous, rational selves, towards a much more interdependent and variable notion of identity, alongside relational practices and meanings, I think, as well. People have kind of played around with the terms a bit, identities, identifications, and I think we need to, when we talk about identity and identities, to include ideas about identification and identifications, about self and other, about sameness and difference. And in our study, which the book is based on, there's two studies actually brought together, we thought and wrote a lot about sameness and difference, because this really brings us to the heart of a lot of this struggle to separate while staying connected, and to become unique while remaining one of the group. And this is something that siblings really struggle with all the time. And Freud emphasised that wish to belong, to be part of a collective and understood as the same as, was kind of constantly at odds, really, with our desire to be an individual, our desire, our groupishness, he called it. So, also, identification isn't just an individual matter, it's profoundly subject to the influence of the social world, and our book really kind of addresses that very directly. The second question, what do we gain and is anything lost when we don't investigate identity in the singular? Well, I really can answer is there anything lost if we don't investigate identity in the singular? And I think that it's important both to look at identity and identities, because how else, if we don't look at identity in the singular, how else can we think about and perhaps even know something, however partial, of our own and others' private internal worlds? We all have them, and we all know we have them. We're not sure if anybody else has them, but we know that we have them. So the siblings in our study really illuminate some of the contradictions of sibling relationships and all relationships with others, of relationality.